This Halloween, we are fantasy football, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to give you our best quarterbacks, tight ends, and defensive plays. Starting off at tight ends, the tier 1 guys that you start every single week, regardless of matchup, are going to be Bowers, Kelsey, and McBride. Obviously, usually Kittle would be here, but sadly, Kittle is on bye. Looking at Bowers, you see a career high 91% of the snaps this past week. If you look over the past month since Davante Adams has been dealt, you're actually looking at 12, 10, 14, and 5 targets for Bowers. So the man is averaging 10 targets a game at the tight end position. Now, of course, with that being said, typically you'd expect that this is one of the worst offenses in the league. This week, however, it's a pretty good matchup that you have going up against Cincinnati, so I'm not going to fault you at all if you wanted to go through and rank Brock Bowers as the number 1 tight end overall. Travis Kelsey will be tight end 2 here. With Kelsey, you finally see the touchdown in week 8. We have been talking about some positive touchdown regression coming in his direction. Plus, it's a phenomenal matchup that you have here going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So you're coming off a 25-point performance. We've seen since Rashee Rice has been injured, the targets go up to 9, 10, 5, and 12. That Kelsey's expanding his role. The touchdowns are coming. I think Kelsey top 3 tight end every single week. Lock it in. And Trey McBride's actually the 3rd tight end in fantasy in total points scored. But what's hilarious is Trey McBride is yet to score a touchdown. You've seen 9, 6, 6, 9, 8, 7, 11 targets, 0 total touchdowns. So honestly, McBride's probably going to be due very, very soon for some positive touchdown regression. I think you can make an argument to have him over Kelsey. My thing is, I just like the matchup going up against Tampa more than I like the matchup going up against Chicago. Now, our next 2 tight ends will be the combo of Evan Ingram as well as David Njoku. This is the highest that we've actually ranked Evan Ingram so far this season. But, as we talked about with the buy low video, here you're in a situation in which you get the injury to both Brian Thomas Jr., Christian Kirk, and Gabe Davis. Every single receiver here in Jacksonville is banged up. Obviously, we know for sure that you have no Christian Kirk. I think there's a very good shot that you're sitting here with no Brian Thomas Jr. as well. So Evan Ingram should be almost a lock for double-digit targets. My hesitation is going up against Philly here. You have an implied team total of only 19 points. So sportsbooks are telling us that the Jags should be one of the worst offenses in the league. With David Njoku here as our next option, over the past 3 weeks, we have seen him average 9 targets a game. Obviously, over the past 2 games, since you had Jameis come under center, pretty much this offense has turned 180, and it looks like it may actually be viable going into the future. David Njoku suffered the injury back in week 1, but since then, you've consistently seen him climb with his snap participation from 42% up to 74%, up to 82%, then up to 84%. So the routes are increasing. The quarterback plays better. The matchup this week against the Chargers isn't as good as what you had this past week against the Ravens. But also, you don't have a locked and loaded alpha wide receiver 1 here. So I think David Njoku should be a must-start option every single week. Very similar to what you have with Cade Otton. Cade Otton, we're going to have here at tight end 6. Rest of season, I think you can make an argument for him in certain matchups, potentially ahead of David Njoku, potentially ahead of Evan Ingram. The issue that you're going to have here is you're going up against the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs are about 8-point favorites in this game. You only have an implied team total of 18.5 points here for this Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense. So you are naturally expecting some regression to hit. But even with that being said, the man's averaging 24, 25 points per game over the past 2 weeks. No Evans, no Godwin. The target distribution has gone way the hell up for Cade Otton. This past week, you get 29 fantasy points, which, unless I'm mistaken, I think the only other tight end that's come close to that this season has been George Kittle. Now, our next name will be Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts, 25 fantasy points this past week. Now, what's actually funny is if you're looking at the targets, you only had 5, right? So, this is probably a little bit unsustainable, but nonetheless, Kyle Pitts is currently sitting as tight end 4 so far this year. We've talked about him previously being the must-start option because you are consistently seeing 4 or 5 targets a game in one of the league's best offenses. And this game against the Dallas Cowboys actually does project to be the highest scoring game in the NFL, according to Las Vegas sportsbooks. So I do think you want to be as aggressive as you can with these Falcons options. Our next option will be Dalton Kincaid. With Kincaid, it's hilarious. It's been like clockwork over the past 5 weeks. You've had 7 targets, 6 targets, 7 targets, 6 targets, 7 targets. Going to play Miami, you actually have this supposedly as the highest scoring offense in the NFL this week, according to sportsbooks. Now, of course, with that being said, Kincaid hasn't exactly been super efficient so far this season. While at the same time, we are going to assume that Amari Cooper does continue to expand his role and Amari Cooper does continue to see more and more target volume here. So I think if Amari expands, it's going to be bad for Kincaid regardless. But I do want to reiterate, this should be the highest scoring offense in the league. Our next option will be Sam Laporta. I made a mistake last week to start Cole Kmet over Laporta. I'm not doing it this week. I will have Laporta back in my lineup. Laporta gives us the 16.5 points. I think y'all know this, but I was very high on Laporta this year. I mean, he had an ADP in round 4 in underdog drafts. I was taking him every chance I had. In round 4 of the Flock League, I drafted him there as well. He's been extremely disappointing. He's been in tight end 2 so far this season after the best rookie tight end season of all time. But we did just get a season high with both his fantasy points as well as his targets. So maybe you have some hope here. Against the Packers, I don't love the matchup. I want Love to be playing. That way, obviously, Detroit has to throw the ball. Going over to Jake Ferguson as our next play. I mean, with Ferguson, you had 8 targets this past week. I was actually terrified because if Ferguson had 1 catch on the final 2 drives, I would have lost my matchup. So my eyes were glued to the screen, making sure Ferguson had nothing. He drew a couple targets that were meaningless. Ultimately, you only have 23 receiving yards. You had 11 receiving yards the week prior against Detroit. I do think that Ferguson's still a tight end that you can comfortably roll with, however, because you still won't have Brandon Cooks in this matchup. And going up against the Atlanta Falcons, again, there is an over-under of about 53.5 points, so it should be the highest scoring game in the NFL this week. Cole Kmet will be the next name. With Kmet, it's so frustrating to see what you had this past week against Washington. The snaps are still very high. I know a lot of people were concerned about the Gerald Everett usage coming into the year. That's turned out to be absolutely nothing. What you need to see is you need to see Caleb Williams just continue to improve. If Caleb gets better, Kmet will be more exciting. I have no idea if Dallas Goedert is going to play or not. If Goddard does play, this is probably about where I put him. Obviously, coming back from the hamstring would be a little bit hesitant. TJ Hockenson coming back from his own injury would be a little bit hesitant there, but all reports are saying that Hockenson should be 100% good to go. And if we were ranking these tight ends from a talent perspective, I think Hockenson would be up there, possibly in tier 1. And then Tucker Kraft, our last option here. Kraft's had 5 touchdowns over the past 25 targets. That's probably going to dramatically come down, as well as the big plays. But of course, if Jordan Love were to be healthy this week, we would move Tucker Kraft up these rankings. This is very hard to know without the confirmation on Love. And then Dalton Schultz leading off for next here. You can start Schultz if you want, obviously, in this game going up against the New York Jets. You have no Nico, you have no Diggs. So Dalton Schultz should have a considerable amount of target volume. If you're looking at Schultz right now on Underdog, they have him higher, lower, 42.5 receiving yards, which would actually be the second best game that you've seen so far this season. But again, I think you could project Schultz to be much better this week than he has been previously based off the injuries that you have in this offense. But of course, if you want to say Mason Dalton Schultz is a bum, there's no way he gets to 43 receiving yards. They actually had Dalton Schultz for about the same amount of yards as Cedric Tillman this week. You can find that over on Underdog Fantasy if you want to go Schultz for fewer than 42.5 receiving yards, Tillman for higher than 44.5 receiving yards. The link's in the description, the link's in the comment section. Promo code FLOCK, you're going to get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000 plus a free pick'em. If you sign up before the Thursday night game, it'll be a free CJ Stroud pick, more than less than half a total yard, and a free team review that we are doing in the live stream every single night. Just make sure that you set up an account on Underdog Fantasy with promo code FLOCK and make that $10 deposit. Now going over to what we have with our next option, Mark Andrews. Over the past 3 weeks, you've had 4 touchdowns off of 13 targets. Do I think Mark Andrews is going to continue to score a touchdown on every 3 targets? No, he's not. I think that we've been kind of lucky. If you look at the underlying volume, you've seen 2, 5, 1, 1, 5, 4, 4, 5 targets this season. In an environment going up against Denver where they are favored by almost 10 points, they're not going to have to throw the ball. Right now, sportsbooks are telling us that the Patriots will have the worst offense in the NFL this week with no Drake May, so not as excited about Hunter Henry. Zach Ertz has had very consistent target volume. I think you could start Zach Ertz if you wanted. And then Gesicki, I'm only going to include him here because I feel like we need to talk about him. I know people are excited, but he only had a great game last week with no T. Higgins. I mean, if you look at games that Higgins has played here, Gesicki's been much, much worse. Now, going over to quarterback, Lamar, obviously, start him every single week, regardless of what the matchup is. The best QB in fantasy. Jalen Hurts, start him every single week, regardless of what the matchup is. He's my QB2 rest of season as well. Josh Allen, you start him every single week, regardless of what the matchup is. This week in particular, you do have the Bills, supposedly as the highest scoring offense in the league. Obviously, back in week 2 against Miami, Allen didn't really do anything in fantasy purposes because the game wasn't competitive, but hopefully Tua can keep the Dolphins in it. And then Jaden Daniels, tier 1 quarterback, you start him every single week, regardless of matchup. These top 4 guys, unless the quarterback's on the bye week, I would not even roster another guy. I'm going down to tier 2. These are also must-start players every single week, regardless of the matchup. Starting with Joe Burrow. Burrow's QB6 so far this season in total points scored. I mean, obviously, you don't have the rushing upside, so you are very much reliant on just the passing volume being there. It is a great matchup going up against the Raiders, however. Right now, you do have extremely high projections for this Bengals offense, assuming that they are forced to throw the ball, of course. Now, what we want to see is we want to see T. Higgins good to go. If Higgins does miss, I would actually have Burrow a little bit lower. If you look at the games where Higgins has played this season with Joe Burrow, we've seen 25, 17, 34, 19, 15 points. In the games that Higgins has missed, you've seen 8, 17, and 13. Now, Kyler Murray will be our next option. Don't love the matchup with Kyler going up against Chicago. I know a lot of people are frustrated with Kyler for being up and down. The reality is, even in the games in which you don't have a ton of passing volume, you still actually get the rushing upside. So it simply doesn't matter if you're playing in a 4-point passing touchdown format where Kyler does give you a lot more rushing upside than pretty much any quarterback outside of the top tier options. You probably need to start them. I'm going down to what we have with our next tier of options. We're going to be looking at Kirk Cousins. Pretty much everybody beyond these guys are just weekly streamers. I think Cousins is a streamer, but this week against Dallas, where this should be the highest scoring game in the NFL, and sportsbooks are telling us that this should be the second highest scoring offense in the NFL, only behind the Bills, I feel very comfortable to start Cousins against Dallas. Mahomes was a quality start last week in a great matchup against the Raiders. Arguably, this matchup is even better going up against Tampa. You go back 2 weeks, Lamar gives you the 5 passing touchdowns against the Bucs. You go back this past week, and obviously you ended up with a total of 276 passing yards and 4 passing touchdowns with Cousins. So over the past 2 weeks, we've seen 9 passing touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks playing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And then Dak Prescott, I think, could be a viable play as well. Again, I do want to reiterate that this should be an extremely high-scoring game. Now, our next tier, guys, also, these are streamers. I just think that maybe they have a little bit worse matchups. Sam Darnold, I'm extremely excited to see from a real-life perspective, now that we are actually going to get a hint and get a little glimpse of what the expectation should be with TJ Hawkinson back in this offense. I think Hawkinson back in should actually really help this team where Addison hasn't been a super strong option at number 2 all season. Jared Goff will be our next play with Goff going up against Green Bay. I don't love the matchup. I would actually not like it even more if Jordan Love were to miss, because then in that environment, I would just expect everything to go through both David Montgomery as well as Jahmyr Gibbs. Craziest thing, though, is if you go through and compare the incompletions to touchdowns for Jared Goff over the past 3 weeks let's go over the past, let's go over the past 5 weeks here for Goff. Week 3 against Arizona, 5 incompletions, 2 passing touchdowns. Week 4 against Seattle, 0 incompletions, 2 passing touchdowns. Week 6 against Dallas, 7 incompletions, 3 passing touchdowns. Against Minnesota, 3 incompletions, 2 passing touchdowns. Against Tennessee, 3 incompletions, 3 passing touchdowns. Goff has been otherworldly so far this season. This is by far and away the best offense in the NFL. The issue obviously is in fantasy. Goff's not going to run the ball. And Gibbs and Montgomery can handle a ton. Going over to Geno. Geno's been pretty damn bad over the past 3 weeks. But if you have Metcalf coming back in, I think you could get a bounce back here in an environment against the Rams, where potentially we could see 40-50 Geno dropbacks. Matthew Stafford goes from being a quarterback that I would never even consider to now when you get Puka and cut back in. I think Stafford is viable. Again, the issue is obviously the rushing upside simply is not going to be there. Derek Carr won't have rushing upside either, but Derek Carr this week has a phenomenal matchup going up against Carolina. I think this is the first week that you can look to start Carr in a very, very long time. CJ Stroud, I understand people are going to be upset to see him this low. Most weeks he's going to be much higher than this, but this has been a poor Jets rush defense, and it has been a good Jets passing defense. If you're looking at what you have right now with his higher, lower on Underdog, he is higher, lower 221.5 passing yards. I do think it'd be very difficult to rely on Stroud with no Diggs and no Nico in a tough matchup on a Thursday night. Caleb Williams will be our next QB. I'm actually going to be starting Caleb Williams in the Flock League this week, and I am starting him over somebody like Derek Carr, but the reasoning for that is they're in the same tier. I think that they're about the same, and I do still see more long-term upside with Caleb than almost any other quarterback in this tier not named Stroud, plus good matchup, of course. Tua, really bad matchup going up against Buffalo. Last time he played Buffalo, he scored 8.5 points. You have a spread on this game, about 8.5 points as well. So the Dolphins are supposed to get boat raced. Baker Mayfield's been the number 2 quarterback in fantasy this season. Baker Mayfield has been so much better than, 99% of the quarterbacks out of him in the rankings here. But with that being said, this week against the Chiefs, sportsbooks are currently putting the projection with this Bucs offense as a bottom 3 offense in the NFL. I know you're going to scream, well, Mason, that's idiotic. Mason, blah, blah. The Chiefs have an elite defense. You have no weapons here for Baker now. Baker, you have seen 7 interceptions over the past 3 weeks. And I will reiterate what we have said time and time again, and I will stand by until the day I die, that sportsbooks know more than you do. Sportsbooks know more than I do. They have more information at their disposal. They have more data than any of us. And I think we can be using the lines that they put out as really strong baselines of what you should expect for overall offensive output. Bo Nix as our next play. Obviously, Bo Nix has been incredible over the past month. Let's revisit who has Bo Nix played over the past month. You've seen the Raiders, the Chargers, the Saints with no Carr, and the Panthers. This week right here, you have an implied team total at 18.25 points. Sportsbooks are telling us that Denver is supposed to be the 3rd lowest scoring offense in the NFL here against Baltimore. Obviously, this Ravens defense has been bad. Bo Nix has been good. I can read a box score just like you can. Trust me, I know. But with that being said, this is a statement ranking. I have no interest in starting Bo Nix. I don't have much interest starting Jameis either. I know Jameis just went over 300 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. Looks great. It's a tough matchup here going up against the Chargers. Jameis is not going to run the ball at all. Joe Flacco's not going to run the ball at all. And Joe Flacco is a tough matchup as well against Minnesota. The bottom 3 guys, I think that they are kind of trap plays this week. Now, going over to DSTs, I will admit, as we do every single week, this is my first year playing with defenses and kickers since like 2020 or 2017, a very long time. So these defensive rankings, you probably want to ignore. You probably want to throw them in the garbage. Tier 1, I'm viewing the Saints. Last time the Saints played Carolina, they had 4 sacks, a fumble recovery, and 2 interceptions, and only allowed 193 receiving yards. We had the Baltimore Ravens. I understand, yes, the Ravens defense has been garbage. They just let up a ton of points in Cleveland. But at home against Denver, sportsbooks are putting this as a spread at like 9.5 points. Denver's supposed to get smacked. Again, I do want to reiterate, I believe the sportsbooks. The only issue that you really have with Baltimore here is they've had a very hard time generating pressure so far this season. And then our next defense will be the Kansas City Chiefs. I mean, you've had, 7 interceptions over the past 3 weeks for Baker. He doesn't have any of his weapons anymore. You have a massive spread in this game, 8.5 points. Our next tier, we're going to have the Vikings. The Vikings, I would be more excited about if they got to play Richardson. Definitely more excited to play the Vikings defense this week. I know y'all were upset that we had them so low in the rankings last week. Well, last week was a tough matchup going up against the Rams. So I don't know what you want from me. The Vikings defense definitely has been much worse than they were at the beginning of the season, but I still stand by. I think it's one of the better defenses in the league. The Titans got blown out. Titans have a garbage defense. Absolutely horrendous. The only saving grace is they get to play the Patriots with no Drake May. So when you get to play the Patriots with no Drake May, sportsbooks are telling us that the Pats will have the worst offense in the NFL this week from a total points scored perspective. You do get 2 forced fumbles. You get 4 sacks last week. I know it's not really a football game, of course, when you're playing the Lions backups. Going over to our next defense, we're going to be looking at the Bengals. The Bengals also have a garbage defense. They just scored -4 points against Philly. They allowed Philly to drop 37 points against them, almost 400 yards, and didn't generate a single sack. But it's a good matchup that you have against the Raiders. This is the tough spot. The good defenses have bad matchups this week. The bad defenses have good matchups. Like the Eagles going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars. It's a whatever defense, but right now the spread on this game is massive. Jacksonville's dealing with a ton of injuries. The Chargers, I do think that you could see a collapse from this Browns offense potentially with Jameis. I think there's a wide range of outcomes. The Commanders going up against the Giants. The only thing is this is obviously an in-division game. Spread's only 3.5 points. Bills, massive spread on this game. I think you can make an argument that the Bills are even a better play than this. The Jets going up against Houston. And then the last tier, Patriots, Lions, Browns, Texans, Cardinals, and Bears. Super hard week to rank defenses. I have no idea what I'm doing here. Again, like I said, the bad defenses have great matchups. The good defenses have bad matchups this week. So it is a pretty tough spot. But again, I appreciate you. I really hope you have a great Halloween. Of course, we'll be live streaming before the game. I'll be live streaming after the game. I really hope I get to see you then. And at the same time, if you wanted to take advantage of that free CJ Stroud pick, more than less than half a total yard over there on Underdog, you can find that link in the description, find it in the comment section. Promo code FLOCK will give you a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you're going to be getting a free team review over there on flockfantasy.com. Just set up an account on flockfantasy.com with that same email address. But I appreciate you and really hope we get to see you out in the live stream later tonight.